Good evening and welcome to another session of Imagining New Stories of Race and Religion. This is our penultimate session. Next week will be our last session together, but I'm glad that you all are here. And those of you who have been here throughout, I hope that you're appreciating the journey. I appreciate that you're joining me in the conversation. We've talked a bit about the difference between stories and narratives, and then we looked at how race and how religion are often how the narratives of those work, and what it tends to do or be able to do. And so at this point, we're going to focus more on new stories or new narratives. And so this week, we were looking at the idea of counter narratives. I hope that people had an opportunity to um, look at the materials for the week. I hope they were helpful for you. What we look at when we think about the work of narratives is narratives often create a boundary within which people understand their possibilities exist. Their world exists within the boundaries created by a variety of narratives. That means that their behavior, their possibility horizon, their emotional constraints are all suggested by a particular narrative structure and narrative form. And among those macro narratives or meta narratives, master narratives, as it talks about in the article, the master narratives are um, race and religion. And what we know is that race and religion aren't unified narratives. There's not a singular narrative of race and religion. In some places, the narrative is more constrained, and so you have a less of a range of possible actions within the narrative, or less of a range of possible ways of thinking, or a slimmer epistemology. You have fewer places from which you can draw your resources, your knowledge, if you're in a particular narrative form. But in other places, there are multiple narratives operating. And so we want to notice that there's never just a single narrative in operation. One of the resources that we looked at, hopefully got a chance to see the TED Talk that is entitled The Danger of a Single Story. And the author talked about how having a single story creates a very flattened view of a person or of people or of a place. And so there's a way in which the single story also only gives you a singular perspective, which makes other possibilities difficult to imagine. So we looked at that. And then we looked at the way that narratives, certain master narratives, create the possibility for underlying what we would call cultural violence, not culture as a culture of violence, but cultural violence in the sense that certain narratives, as they are believed, accepted, retold, represented, give sense making. They allow structural violence and direct violence to make sense. So in the case of the Syrian dancer, the no studios that men were allowed to attend, no ballet studios that men were allowed to attend, that's structural violence. That's a limiting, oppressing the opportunity. In the same way, the dancer describes the way that his father actually used physical violence against him, the way his father would burn his ballet clothes as a way of getting him to conform to a particular way of being. And that way of being is within the constraints of the narrative, in that instance, of maleness. In that particular context, it was a narrative of maleness that ballet did not conform with or was outside of. And so what we know is narratives do their work, and they continue to do their work because they create a kind of consensus of some sort that others agree with, so that others will participate in constraining behavior. They will cooperate in making sure that people conform to a particular way of thinking. And so today we wanted to begin talking about counter narratives and the possibility of counter narratives, or how to construct counter narratives. So I think I want to invite the panelists to join, to reveal themselves, opening their cameras, and then introducing themselves. And then let's spend some time talking about counter narratives.
Professor Hooker, I'm joining today, if that's okay.
That's perfect. That is so exciting. That is so exciting. Mana, you're joining us. Very nice. Thank you. Very
Hello.
nice. Hello. Hello. Ronnie, welcome back. Would you all, just for the other folks, just introduce yourselves to make sure that people know who you are? I'll go in this direction. Ronnie, then Mana, then Mahan. So just briefly introduce yourselves.
Hello, Mana.
Hello.
I live in Northern Illinois, and I'm finding these courses very interesting, these discussions. I'm pretty interested in racism and all kinds of discrimination against different kinds of people, especially in healthcare.
Perfect. Welcome. Mana.
Hi. So I live in South Bend, Indiana. I work at St. Mary's College, and I've attended all of the sessions, love every one of them, very interested in the topic. Don't know what else you want me to add.
That's fine. I appreciate the fact that you've been here and you decided that it wasn't too dangerous to participate as a panelist. That's very exciting. I appreciate the courageous nature of that decision.
We'll see if I have anything of value to add to the conversation.
You certainly do. You certainly do. Mahan Mirza.
Yes, I'm Mahan. I also live in South Bend. I'm actually part of the Ansari Institute that brings these classes to the community. But I consider myself a lifelong student, and a bit of a selfish for me to participate in trying to orchestrate these, because I benefit from them as much as anyone else. And great to be here.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you all. So this evening we're talking about counter narratives. And this is really important. So I know I haven't posed a question to you in advance. I know probably it would be helpful for you to get these questions in advance. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about it beforehand. But this is really the question. Can you describe for us a particular narrative that was given to you maybe as a child, a narrative around race, religion, or gender even, that was given to you as a child, and you found it in some way constraining, so that you had to create a counter narrative to allow yourself to more fully flourish or more fully become who it is that you believe that you should be? And I know that's like, it may take you a second to think about it. So let me just give you 30 seconds or so to kind of looking for, and I want you to be able to name the narrative as it was given, and then what was necessary to break from it, or what you saw, or what the counter narrative was that you had to create in order to move outside of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know this in advance, so it's not planned, but I can think of several. The one perhaps that I'd share would be growing up in Pakistan. The narrative is called the two-nation theory, which is that Hindus and Muslims are two separate nations.
Mhm.
They have different lifestyles, beliefs, modes of being, and they cannot live together
Mhm.
as one uh, big nation.
Mhm.
And so they need to be partitioned and live as two nations that respect each other
Mhm.
side by side, but not together.
Mhm.
Um, First of all, we grew up with this, and it's interesting because there's some internal contradictions within it once you begin to unpack it. One of them is that you can't fully separate the nation. So there's going to be minorities of Muslims in India and minorities of Hindus and other traditions in Pakistan.
Mhm.
And the idea is that each nation will respect its minorities
Mhm.
as equals. Well, and you begin to wonder, well, if that's the case, why can't they figure
Right.
it out at the bigger level? And
Mhm.
so there's a dissonance, and sometimes you can find, I think, dissonance just within a narrative, but often times you have to leave it and find an
Mhm.
external frame. So my
Mhm.
travels, coming to the United States, reading more broadly and interacting with wonderful Indians and Hindus, you have less of that in Pakistan. It
Mhm.
just breaks the narrative.
So, can you recognize one small constraint of all? I mean, I know that there's a lot of stuff, but what was one thing that didn't seem possible inside of that narrative, but outside of the narrative is possible?
Sitting together and eating,
Mm. Sure, sure, sure.
something as simple as that.
Right, right. Okay.
Um, are there purity issues? I mean, it was like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, uh, and it's very unfortunate.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
Good. Thank you for that. That's a good start. I'm going to come back and try and unpack that a little bit more, ask a couple of questions to help unpack that a little bit more. Um, Mana, Ronnie, either?
Okay, so more along gender lines, my mother was a nurse, so of course, I was going to grow up and be a nurse. And first you get a baby doll to take care of, and then you get an older kind of doll, and you learn how to care for people. And when I was in high school, the acceptable things for the girls to do were teach, be a secretary, or be a nurse.
Mm-hmm.
And so I chose nursing. But I didn't go to one of those really safe places like St. Francis Hospital in Evanston or Presbyterian St. Luke's. I chose Cook County Hospital in Chicago. So that was my one way of breaking out of the mold that my parents thought I should follow in my nursing career. And then, of course, I've gone on to do other things.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it became easier once I made that kind of choice, and all the things that would go along with, training in a big county
Mm-hmm.
hospital.
Mm-hmm.
It made it easier to make a lot of other choices. So,
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to make an assumption, or at least raise a question in that. I wonder if there was your stated moving out of the narrative was to do exactly what they expected you to do, which was to be a nurse, but to not do it in a place where they thought was safe,
right.
right? Yeah. And I wonder if that was an intersectional kind of concern where it wasn't just gender, but it was racialized as well, because Cook County, deep in the heart of Chicago, is a very different, and there's a narrative of the lack of safety. The more melanin, the less safe, right? And so
Right.
Cook County would be that kind of place. And so I'm wondering if there was an intersectionality that allowed you to do the one thing in exactly the way that they expected, but to do it in a different place. And so that was where the narrative was being countered.
Well, yes and no, because my mother trained at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. So that was the kind of
Yeah.
same, kind of thing. And so maybe that colored her thought about where I should go. We never really had that kind of discussion. So,
Right, but East Baltimore is one of the most segregated places. That's why they have the wall up at Hopkins. And so you actually can't go straight from the Black neighborhood into Hopkins. You've got to go 8 blocks up to come back around and down. So you got to think about it. Baltimore was physically separated, and Johns Hopkins was on the other side. And every time they would buy up land, they would move the wall. So I don't know what years your mother trained at Hopkins, but that wall was being moved to keep Black folks on the other side of Hopkins. But that's interesting. Yeah.
yes. And I think that Cook County was probably primarily Black and people of, brown and
Sure.
other, Asians and things, but primarily Black.
Right.
But I was interested in the most interesting pathology there was.
Mhm.
So,
Which is probably racism, but that's different.
is it? Maybe. Maybe.
Absolutely.
I never thought of it like that.
So it's an interesting question for me. And if I may, I'd like to make 2 points. The first, which doesn't answer your question directly, but the second one will.
Okay.
So my first point is that as a member of the Baha'i faith, I always have all my life and continue to feel like I live in a counter narrative.
Yeah.
That the narrative around me is the norm, and my faith is the counter narrative.
Right.
However, and that was my first point.
Okay.
The second point, though, that answers your question more directly is that I grew up in an Iranian family. And so that cultural narrative, which doesn't necessarily, it mostly coincided with the Baha'i narrative, but it also didn't, because it followed the cultural path, the Iranian cultural path. And in that narrative, echoing a little bit of what Ronnie was saying, the gender narrative is that young women marry, at least by the time they're 30, and start a family. I did not do that. And not sure that it was necessarily conscious, but I do know that around the age of 25 or so, I received a lot of pressure from family and friends to get married. And that's when things like, what about so-and-so? And can I introduce you to so-and-so? And what do you think of so-and-so? That all started around my mid-20s. And I did not want to do, in fact, every time anyone introduced anyone now, someone that would be a prospective spouse, that actually made me not want to know that person, nor like that person. Whether, whatever, they may have been wonderful people, but that was my rebellion. And I didn't actually get married until the age of 36. To a man of my choice. Yeah.
So would you do us a favor? Some people are more or less familiar with Baha'i as a tradition, and you describe it in terms of it being fully a counter narrative. And so it may be helpful for others on the in the webinar for you to talk just a bit about the principle of Baha'u'llah and the principles and of the faith.
Sure. So the Baha'i faith started in Iran in the mid-19th century. As David just mentioned, Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, was born in Iran and lived most of his life in prison and exile, and ended up in what was Palestine at the time. The principles of the Baha'i faith include, and predominant in those principles, is the oneness of humanity. And the part of it that is very counter narrative, very much of a counter narrative in the United States, is that very early on, when the Baha'i faith came to the United States, which was in the very late 19th century. In fact, 1894, I think, was the first mention. The early, the Americans who embraced the Baha'i faith early in the 20th century were predominantly white until about the 19 teens or so, 1909, 1910. And then a few African Americans became Baha'i, and the whole, the premise, the foundation of the faith, which is the oneness of humanity and the elimination of all prejudices, racial and otherwise, was very hard to establish, as you can imagine. And for a long time, particularly in the early community in Washington, D.C. and in New York, there were like meetings for the white Baha'is and then meetings for the black Baha'is. And it really wasn't until Abdul Baha, who was the son of Baha'u'llah, made his trip to the United States in 1912 that he spoke extensively about the oneness of humanity and encouraged the Baha'is to start meeting with each other and encourage intermarriage. In fact, one of the early Black Baha'is was a lawyer, Louis Gregory, and Abdul Baha arranged a marriage in a way. He introduced him to Louisa Matthew, who was a British white woman, and encouraged them to get married, and they did, and which was, I'm sure, quite difficult in the 1920s, and they lived a long time. Yeah, and then the other counter narrative, of course, is that the Baha'is in Iran have been persecuted from the very beginning of the faith, and many of them killed, many exiled, etc.
So this is it's interesting because there's a trajectory. Many religious traditions have a trajectory of both being oppressive and being oppressed. There's like some history of persecution and victimness, and there's some history of being oppressed. The two are somewhere in many religious and faith traditions, and many of them actually create carve-outs. Like Mahan was saying, that Hindu should be separate from Muslims. For some reason, there's a carve-out. It defines self and other in a particular way. And at least the Baha'i tradition seeks to be countercultural by saying there are no other. There is no other, right? And in that way, it becomes problematic in the presence of other more formed narratives, right?
Right.
So what I want to invite each of you to do with the story that you told, this is how we build counter narratives. You ask yourself, the narrative that I was given, that I ultimately moved away from, what is it that I would have had to believe in order to embrace that narrative? And then you say, well, what did I believe? And what does that belief make possible, right? So what was it that you would have had to believe? Mahan, what was it that you would have to believe in order to embrace the notion of the reasonable separation, the two-nation proposition of Hindu and Muslims in India and Pakistan? What would you have had to believe for that, to embrace that?
I think one of the things you'd have to believe in, when there's a distinction and you're on one side, that you're somehow better than what's on the other side. So this I don't know if I use the word supremacy, this idea that we are better because of what we believe, and they are lesser because of what they believe. And theologically, all theologies, I should say most theologies, have to contend with this notion of otherness. And it's great that we have a Baha'i person here to complicate that idea. So it's really wonderful. But I think that's at the core of it. And
so
then,
if I'm inviting you to name it sympathetically, because this is also the part of creating counter narratives. If you're inviting others into reconsidering the narrative, you want to be able to say sympathetically, like, what is it that I would believe or could believe that would cause me to, and it may be that supremacy is the thing, but it may also be that there's a sympathetic articulation of what they believe that you may still have believed if you were inside of that narrative.
I'm trying to think. I'm not sure if I can answer that.
It's hard once you're outside of the, once you've embraced the counter narrative, it's really hard to go back in sympathetically, right?
So you're inviting me to ponder that, were I to be still in that narrative, how would I defend it?
Right. How would you explain it? Yeah. How would you make it make sense? Like, so that other people would realize it is a reasonable, if you were still in it, how would you teach it to your children?
Yeah. So you're asking me to have narrative empathy with a narrative that I've abandoned.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
That's a really tough ask, but I'm going to go for it. So what I would say is, look, I would focus in that case probably on Islam rather than Hinduism. And I would say that Islam is a religion that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, and it brings to us the true teachings of monotheism. And there are people who don't adhere to that path or believe in it. And so it's difficult for us to then partake of the same, of a communal life that is going to be meaningful and holistic, given that very basic distinction.
Right. And that's a reasonable thing to accept. Like, yeah, I got it. We do one, they do many. It's kind of hard for us to break bread, so let's not. Right.
Yeah. And those of you, if their viewers were catching this in the middle, you have to go back to the beginning. So that this is not where we are.
If you catch up in the middle of this story, you could be like, concerned about the conversation we're having.
In this day and age, they take a clip of you and say, look what he's saying.
Right. Exactly.
No soundbite. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Ronnie, to embrace the reasonableness, the good sense, the loving, wisdom-based instruction that your parents and community offered you, that as a girl of a certain age, you should plan to be a teacher, a nurse, or what was the third thing?
Secretary.
Or secretary, right. What would you have to believe in order to embrace that?
I think I would have to believe that those were the acceptable things, jobs for women to train for, and that things that interested men, like engineering and whatever else, science-related things, those were not acceptable for women.
So what makes it acceptable, though? Like, so acceptable is one of those things. So what is it that, what's the belief that crafts acceptability?
I think for teaching, being a secretary or a nurse, you would always have a job. If you were to choose engineering or even law, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, they hire you as a legal secretary, but not as a lawyer.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I think in some of those other areas, and there were, I grew up in a very small town. Had I grown up in the city, in Chicago or some other large city, the story might have been a little different.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah. Mona, what would you have to believe? Like you were inside of a counterculture. You were inside of a counter narrative. So let me ask you a different question then. Let me press you in a different way.
I actually have an answer, but
okay, no, come on. Okay, come on.
well, I was going to say that the narrative that I was given, I knew intrinsically was not in line with the Baha'i narrative.
Oh.
So I found it almost unacceptable. Like, why would you do that when, as a Baha'i, I also believe in the equality of women and men. And therefore, as a woman, I was taught all my life. So these two things were taught to me at the same time, right? So on the one hand, here are the principles we believe in, which include the equality of women and men. But then, culturally, as a woman, you should get married and have children. And which is not necessarily against what Baha'is believe, but I was given autonomy. I was given the right to choose what I wanted to do with my life from my faith. And so I didn't feel like I had to do that, even though there was pressure from my family. I felt like I had, I had the backing of God.
Right. And so what you had was what people want, which is to have two competing narratives. And you're choosing inside of one or the other, because inside of one narrative, things are possible. There's a certain kind of flourishing, there's an autonomy, there's a sense of self-determination that may be available inside of one narrative that's not available inside of another. Now, inside of the Iranian narrative, there may be a sense of safety, community, tradition, that there's kind of a loving anticipation of a continuation of a way of life, right?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, I teach at St. Mary's. Intercultural studies is one of the things that I teach. So I talk to my students sometimes about arranged marriages and the rationale behind arranged marriages and why they are acceptable to a lot of cultures, and in fact help to build societies and cultures in a certain way, which students don't necessarily understand. Young people in particular don't necessarily understand, because they have the narrative, the Hollywood narrative, that has been, the narrative is you see the person, you fall in love, and that's it, and you overcome all obstacles because you're destined for each other.
And you don't notice that marriages that are done that way, if you get married before 30, doing it that way, it's really just for practice, right? Like, so,
very often
65% of those marriages break up. So, and so there's a durability sometimes in arranged marriages that, may or may not, because you do it for different reasons, but without debating that. So you had what we try to create. When you're trying to create a counter narrative, what you're trying to do, you grew up with the counter narrative present. What you're trying to do is have an equally valid place of reason that you choose, and then you choose which one you want to live in, the one that seems to produce the level of full flourishing that you want to pursue. Like, it would not be problematic to say that what I want to do is maintain the traditions of multiple generations. I want to honor those traditions, which might cause you to diverge from the faith to accept the culture tradition. right? Mahan.
Just quickly, it's a bit of a tangent, but it comes from what you were just talking about. This idea that, you know, the Hollywood marriage, or, you know, that you see someone and you fall in love, and 65% of those marriages don't work, but arranged marriages, at least, you know, maybe tend to work more. I'm not sure of the statistics, but thinking of that in narrative terms, you know, if you're in an arranged marriage, there's almost no prior narrative of the other person,
Right.
and so you develop it together,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, you fall in love, and there's no faking it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas oftentimes what happens is you think you're marrying someone that you've known, and then once you enter the marriage, you're like, well, this is something other than what I had built up in my mind, and so you get thrown for a loop. Your narrative is challenged, and
Right.
that could be one of the reasons why some of those don't work out. But that was totally unscripted, so if it's wrong, my apologies.
No, I think that's right. And actually what happens is, I've said this, I think, before, but we're rarely disappointed by the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground isn't the source of disappointment. The facts on the ground aren't the source of surprise. The source of surprise is that there is a narrative that you're living in, and the facts on the ground don't align with that. So your surprise, your disappointment exist in the gap in the narrative. If the marriage narrative was constructed by Hollywood and movies and things like that, then it's often the case that quarreling, or, you know, not having the money, and whatever the other kinds of things are, the political differences and the kinds of things that cause breakups in relationships, that's because they don't align with the narrative that you bring in. And the person is different because you have a position for them. They are a character in a narrative that you've constructed.
Right.
If you don't have that to begin with, you have to create your characters together. You have to say, okay, what part are you going to play? You know, what are you going to do? What am I going to do? How do we do this? And then it's an ongoing kind of negotiation. It's interesting that religion, many different faith traditions, and race, the assignments of significance based on some color or heritage, assumed color or heritage, they craft stories for us. Like when Ronnie, the idea that people in Cook County, you know, the more melanin, the less safety. Like, you know, Black and brown body people represent a diminished sense of safety from small town Illinois, other parts of the world. That's a narrative. That's not like a direct experience. It's we project that, and then we run with it. And so I wonder if we're trying to craft new stories of race and religion, what are some of the kinds of movements that you can imagine? We're just imagining at this point. None of it's right, none of it's wrong, none of it's the truth. Hopefully they keep that part of the soundbite in if they clip this out and show it somewhere. None of this is right or wrong. It's not like what we're saying is the truth. We're just kind of imagining and playing. What are some of the twists and turns we might take with identity narratives that are constructed by either faith or race, or at the intersection, that will create counter narratives that aren't so constraining or don't result in the kind of hierarchy, separation, that kind of thing? You know what I'm asking?
I think so.
Good.
What was that for, Ronnie?
That's for the three of you. It's to the panel.
I used to think, I probably do still think this, though I haven't it hasn't been on the top of my list of things to ponder lately, that people who are more similar religiously and maybe culturally have a little easier time of making a relationship work.
So tell me what you would have to believe in order to believe that's true. Like what's the backup for that thinking?
I think people that would be a similar religion or culture believe the same kinds of things or believe similar things about how you treat one another, the worth of the woman versus the worth of the man, who's assigned to which duties in the house. I think some of those kind of things might be more similar for people of similar cultures and religions.
And what that assumes is a single story. This is, if we go back to the TED Talk, this assumes a single story that by being in a particular culture, in a particular nationality, in a particular religion, that you have adopted the same narrative within that larger structure that the other has, right?
But would you say that, I agree with what you're just saying and what your interpretation of what Ronnie was saying, but are there certain, if we're thinking in terms of a marriage or relationship or a partnership, ideally, what works is if the two people share values, right? The same. Yeah, I can't even think of another word other than value. What do you give value to?
Sure.
And that may transcend maybe some of the cultural values that each of them brings to this partnership. Like the whole idea of, again, the whole idea of equality and equal rights within a partnership, within a marriage. You may have come from different backgrounds and not have necessarily had that narrative in mind, but if you both agree to it and live by it, then that can work, right? Similarly, if you have the same perspective on, what is a human being, that makes it easier when you talk about raising children, right? How do you raise a child if you believe that that child has, infinite potential, spiritual potential, and then you agree on how to bring that out?
Mohan, you were gonna.
Building on that and thinking of, the narrative that I constructed, the thread on nationalism and the two-nation theory. I'm not saying that there isn't a natural affinity for people of similar faiths or backgrounds, or whether it's linguistic or faith or cultural in a way, the cultural references, for them to have an affinity towards each other are natural. But I think what one way to grow out of that is, at least I think one still needs to have the capacity to not see others who are different from that in enmity, but almost like celebrate, recognize the difference and find it worth celebrating, and also, maybe even agonizing over, but in conversation, and to explore the richness of the human experience and thereby to learn from each other. And there can be exclusivist theologies, but in this day and age, you know, just thinking of, you know, I mean, the Baha'i faith, it's, you know, I have great resonance with it because it's, you know, we're one human family. And the way that then I myself, you know, try to arrive at that from my own theology is when you just ponder over nature. And nature is something that in Islamic theology is a sign of God. And so we are from each other. We can donate blood. We can splice each other's genes. We can even do it now with other, you know, plants. And we've all sprouted from the same kind of cosmic process, and we share the same, you know, material. There's just superficial differences, but essentially it's identical to the core. And so just coming at it from that perspective, I think it enables us to have a capacity that we must have in order to live in the world today. The alternative is unthinkable. And maybe, you know, that comes from travel, from meeting more people, and so on. But I wonder if that's getting to where you were headed.
So yeah, I think that, well, I mean, I appreciate that. And I was actually thinking maybe going exactly in a different direction, which is to say that the assumption that shared culture, shared religion, shared racial assignment creates a similarity or even a proximity is actually really lazy thinking, right? Like, in order, and what we do, what narratives do is invite us to assume that the shared externalities reflect some shared essentialness, which then allows for, you know, better cooperation, where everybody, each of us has some, you know, we each have multiple, we have what I call a valence of identities. You have all of these different aspects of your being that are always in place. Your, you know, primary racial identification has multiple narratives around it. Your primary gender identification, your gender relation has multiple narratives. Your age, your parental status, your, you know, status as a sibling, your educational capacities, all of those have multiple narratives. And in every little context, different parts of it show up, different parts of it intersect to help you interpret that context. So assuming that because we share certain kinds of large macro narrative assignments, that we actually will have shared values, that we actually will have a shared affinity, is where our narrative, where we live inside of the narrative as opposed to interrogating what's actually present, instead of interrogating the facts on the ground, right? And so how do we, I think that, Mahan, what you were saying is both at the quantum level, the metaphysical level, the physics, not just metaphysical, but the physical level. Yes. We share electrons, we share, you know, protons and neutrons. We actually have the illusion of distinction. We operate with the illusion of distinction. But as long as we're operating with the illusion of distinction, that is retained, it's reproduced by the narratives that we use to circumnavigate our distinctions, right? And we use those to also say that this thing that is other, so other is a faulty construction, right? Because we share same electrons and, you know, the same electrons and protons and all of our all of our makeup is actually not static. It's not ours, but it's a shared thing, right? So we actually, illusion is the thing, and narratives perpetuate the illusion of distinction. And then part of that includes other as superior, other as inferior, other as positioned. We put each other into particular categories in our narrative, or and then if they don't behave properly, then we feel a certain way. We have some feelings about that, right? Yeah, come on.
So just a question on that, for clarification. So would it be okay to say that narratives, perpetuate the illusion of absolute distinction,
Mm-hmm.
but in a relative sense, there are certain distinctions, from not valuing the difference. But like this cup is also electrons and protons, as is this computer. But there's a distinction in the way that they're molded,
Yeah.
and and so my question is the following:
Uh-huh.
that you grow up in different cultures, and I'll give you an example. So we're here in South Bend, and we have one mosque, and it's a lovely place. You have Bosnians and people from Uganda, Kenya, different parts of Africa, South Asia, the Arab world, Americans,
Mm-hmm.
people from South Bend, and it's this beautiful, cosmopolitan community. If you go to a big city, you have many mosques,
Mm-hmm.
and you find like the South Asians are going to this one, even if they have to drive like 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a mosque 5 minutes down the road, but that's where all the Turks go.
Right.
And then the Arabs are going on the other side. And that happens, and because you like the tea over there, that's the tea you grew up with, and you can like go back and speak Urdu rather than Turkish.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the kind of distinction I'm talking about, is that it can be there, but it shouldn't then generate an animosity towards the other place.
Right.
And
What
it's
do you?
also, I think, echoing what David was saying, which is it's lazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a lazy way of, because it's comfortable, right? It's
Yeah. Okay. So yeah,
it's easy, it's
that's true.
comfortable. I'm just gonna go where I don't have to work hard to get along with these people.
And it's lazy, and it's stingy too. Like, how come if you have better tea, why wouldn't you bring your tea to this other mosque, right? Why would you, if you know that you're having better tea, why wouldn't you share it with the Bosnians?
But
Because the tea is not actually better. They think it's better, but the Bosnians think their tea is better.
Yeah, exactly. So before I get into too much trouble, I'm not saying the tea in one place is better than the other. What I'm saying is, since I grew up with that tea,
Right.
I enjoy that, and then the others grew up with that tea and they enjoy that better.
Sure.
And you don't have to say mine is better than yours. You can just say, I like the fact that you like your tea so much, just like I like my tea so much, and we can both be happy.
Sure.
To echo what David was just saying, though, you might love your tea and enjoy it very much, but if you try this other tea, you might also like it. And so you've doubled your enjoyment.
Yeah. And you should do that. Yeah.
And I think that what narratives do, this is Pierre Bourdieu, who says, you create kind of a habitus, you create a sense of rightness. There are certain kinds of things, your tastes, your appreciation for certain things is created within a habitus. Like if you didn't grow up in Scandinavia, there's a way that they eat fish and certain other things that just, from somebody who grew up in the southern United States, that is just like what they're doing is really difficult for me. But that's habitus. That's because my tastes have been created, and all of that is inside of a particular narrative, right? And so the narratives constrain our emotions, what we appreciate, what we don't appreciate. And so counter narratives become really important to be able to create a more inclusive space. Enemies exist and can be maintained when the narrative sphere in which they exist don't overlap. If you can create sufficiently co-located narrative spaces, narrative habitus, people can come to see each other, right? If they can't, if you can't do that, then they can legitimately, in their minds, they can narrate a rationale for partition, right? So the narratives create our taste, create our appreciation, create our expectations, and among the master narratives that have guided the way that people show up in the world are these master narratives of race and religion. And, you know, religion has all of its spaces, and, you know, race is a set of fictions that have been passed down and perpetrated in order to do a number of things, particularly related to the distribution of power and access. But then they also create expectations so that someone who is poor may still see themselves as someone who as superior to someone who is wealthy, depending on their racialized categories. If I'm in this, even if I'm poor, I'm better than them, right? That kind of thing. And so the narratives of race, the master narratives around these concepts of race and religion require all of these small counter narratives. And it's the small anomalies in the narratives that are necessary, multiple small anomalies, in order to completely reshape the paradigms that are created by race and religion, the habitus, the tastes, the expectations that are created by them that allow them to continue the distinctions of superiority and inferiority, not just distinction. Other is beautiful. Other that includes hierarchy is problematic. Ronnie, you were about to say something. I think you poked your head up a couple of times, and I was on a roll, so I didn't let you in.
I mean, as the others have talked, and you said something about choosing Cook County, you know, was kind of a racist thing.
No. I didn't say choosing Cook County was a racist thing. I said that I said that the idea that Cook County was dangerous, the notion that being in a place that was characterized by mostly Black and brown bodied people was a narrative that was racialized already.
Okay.
That's why I wasn't saying that your decision was a racist decision.
So I never, I never saw that. I mean, my parents may have seen that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not responsible for what they saw or thought. And yet, I mean, I thought, wow, this is going to be the most interesting pathology of all the places in the city. And I wanted to learn as much as I could. But just as you've been talking, and in some of the other classes, you know, I think about some things in my family, you know, that, you know, at the beginning of racism, you grow up with certain thought patterns because that's what your parents thought and views they espoused. And you just kind of, as a young person, you just kind of accept that. And I think as you move out into the world and meet other kinds of people and travel and read, you know, you realize that maybe their ways of doing things weren't all that good by today's standards. So
I should tell you guys just a little bit of my background on this whole thing, this race and religion thing. I grew up in a small neighborhood in North Avondale in Cincinnati, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And within the bounds of North Avondale, or within the bounds of the children that went to North Avondale Elementary School, we had an extremely wealthy white community. Diamond brokers and, you know, lawyers and judges. We also had an extremely well-established Jewish community that was actually, it had a range of orthodoxy within the Jewish community, right? There were middle-class African Americans. There were very working class African Americans. I grew up on a block where there were mixed race couples. I grew up within walking distance. There was a refugee resettlement center for Central Americans. So Panamanian, Salvadoran, Guatemalan refugee resettlement center. And the other way, there was a refugee resettlement center for Southeast Asian. So Thai, Cambodian, Vietnamese, Hmong. So we all grew up together. And there were some folks, white folks, who had just come down out of Appalachia, out of the mountains. So some of my closest friends were like previously dirt poor white folks, scratch dirt farmers. And we all grew up together. We went to school together. We played, we dated, we played, you know, that foreign football, Mahan, that they play in other parts of the world. We played that on some days. And then on other days, we played our football the way that you're supposed to play football. We, you know, we learned each other's music. We ate each other's food. We celebrated one another's holidays. We did all of those kinds of things. And we went elementary school, and most of us went all the way through high school together. So it wasn't until I left after the first 17 years of my life and left Cincinnati and went to Atlanta that I was apprised of the fact that Black folks and white folks really don't get along, that there is, you know, that there should be some suspicion between Jews and Muslims, and, you know, that we should be suspicious of that because we had all grown up together and nobody bothered to disabuse us of the notion that this wasn't the way that the world was supposed to work. And so I have been offended much of my life since I left by the fact that my parents allowed me to be hoodwinked for 17 years to believe that all of these race and religion and classes and ethnicities and heritages could all get along. Like the idea that that's even a possibility, or that that's the way the world should work. I was hoodwinked for 17 years of my life, and I've been mad about it ever since. We needed a few Baha'i to help us give a narrative about how this was working.
Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. You weren't hoodwinked. You were given a glimpse into what's possible.
Yeah. I was given a glimpse of what's possible and then sent out into the world on a hero's journey to try and recreate it. Like
That's
go do likewise in other parts of the world.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Mahan.
I don't want to, you know, I think that there was also limitations to the narrative that, you know, you grew up in. If I can share a story about you.
Sure.
Professor David Hooker and I were hired together and we went through faculty orientation together at Notre Dame. And since you mentioned you were at Cincinnati, Ohio, it reminded me of this story. So when you come to Notre Dame, there's this narrative, and I buy it. I'm okay with it, that, you know, you're just going to be in awe of the football stadium and that tradition. So part of the faculty tour is, you know, you go through the stadium and they show you the locker room, and you can go and pat, you know, play like a champion today, go down the stairs and run into the stadium and take pictures. So we were in the locker room, and it was a big crowd of faculty. And we were getting stories about, you know, how Notre Dame, you know, bested this team and that team. And then the person who was giving the tour said something about the Ohio State, and it was silent. You know, we were all listening, said the Ohio State. And I heard a voice from the back, boom, D. And everybody went, oh. and we all looked, and it was Professor David Hooker. He said, the Ohio State.
That's right. That is
So he just
exactly right.
shattered the narrative.
Tell the story correctly. So I haven't noticed that we have any questions in the chat. So it's just been us, and it might be that we're the only ones on the call, and that's fine.
No, there are
21 people on.
yeah, several other people on.
Okay, but no one has raised any questions on the chat, and so we've just enjoyed this time together. So this has been great for me. Mahan,
Yes.
do you want to talk about where and how we will proceed? I know I started off the session
Sure.
saying this was our penultimate session, so I'm going to do a session next week where we try to bring all of this together and think about it and that kind of thing. And then
Perfect. Yeah, so first of all, we want to thank you, Professor David Hooker, for the time you've given us, and we're going to keep it to 6 classes. We have a tremendous amount of work at the Keough School and lots of new hires, and we're attending many different talks, and the semester has begun, so it's very busy for us as well. And we've really benefited from Professor Hooker's series. It was originally supposed to be an 8-part series, but we talked and we feel that we can probably wrap it up with a 6-part series. And so the next class will be the last class in this series. And we're working on other classes for everyone. It looks like we're developing a nice community of people who can gather around, kind of like a campfire or a Zoom fire, and get to know each other a little bit. It's good to see familiar faces and new faces, and continue this journey of lifelong learning and sharing. So next week will be Professor Hooker's last class, where he'll bring it all together for us. And we have lots of other events happening. You can check out ansari.nd.edu. If you're not on our email list, please do sign up for that. You can go to our website and scroll to the bottom, and you'll see a little mail and sign up. You're welcome to do that. On February 22nd, which is, you can think of it as not maybe even a continuation of this series and a makeup for the last 2 classes. We have Reverend Jeremiah Wright will be joining us from Chicago in honor of Black History Month, and we're going to have a conversation with him. It's an intergenerational conversation on the crises of our time, and there are many crises, from economic inequality, climate justice, racial justice, and political polarization, and the kinds of violence we see both here and abroad. So we're going to talk to him about all those things. His life has been a life of preaching. His sermons have been, he's a tremendous orator, and when that's taken out of context or in soundbite, it can make for sensational media and political point scoring. He also, in the heat of some moments, said some things that he had to apologize for, and he apologized in a heartfelt way about those things. And so the Ansari Institute, about narrative empathy, redemption, we don't cancel people, not on the left or on the right. We had a panel on evangelicals, on faith in the presidency in November, and on Palestine, on Black History Month, and we hope to continue to do these, perhaps something with the Passover in end of March. And so you can find out about some of these events as well at Ansari, and we'd love to have the community involved in these conversations. So I will leave it at that. So would you like to say anything as we conclude today, this evening?
No, it's a marvelous journey. I appreciate it and look forward to bringing it all together next week to wrap it up.